Stop, rebel scum! You they don't. You're not authorized in this
Okay, so you know the movie Rogue One where a ragtag group of rebels steal the Death Star plans, and how they needed a sizable amount of ground troops to help with the distraction? With a large portion of the rebel fleet in orbit fighting a pitched battle just to barely escape. Oh, and nearly everyone involved in stealing the plans pretty much dies. So there used to be a different story on how that happened in the game Dark Forces, which is no longer canon, where stealing the Death Star plans was done by just one guy, who single-handedly assaulted an entire Imperial base while blasting his way through a legion of stormtroopers like they were nothing. And it wasn't even the main story, that was just the first level in this game, as the rest of the story was this one-man army whose name is Kyle Katarn going after another Imperial superweapon called the Dark Trooper Project, and almost single-handedly taking that down too. There are a bunch of old memes of Kyle that use Chuck Norris jokes to describe him, which makes sense with all he gets up to in the games featuring him. I mean, it was the 90s and peak storytelling for games were characters that were larger than life, especially after the massive success that the release of Doom was. At the time, some did think of Dark Forces as a Doom clone, which isn't entirely unfair. On the surface they seem pretty similar, but when you get into the details, differences do start to show up. For instance, Dark Forces has more of a story than Doom, which focuses more on the gameplay side of things. Which was great for Doom as that suited it perfectly for the pure action experience it was going for. But Dark Forces wanted you to feel like you were going on an epic adventure in the Star Wars universe. So LucasArts added a bit more story to the mix with cutscenes and fairly detailed briefings in between missions, to give context to why you're shooting a near endless army of stormtroopers, and push forward what was being done with first-person shooter games at the time. They managed to do that when they released the game in 1995, with good reviews and selling well. The team even got an email from John Romero after the game release where he said something like, "Now I know how people felt when they played Doom for the first time," which is really high praise coming from one of the people who got the first-person genre of games going in the first place. How the devs achieved this is by creating the Jedi engine for the game, which allowed them to do a few things the Doom engine wasn't doing at the time. This added some gameplay elements that would become standard in shooter games, such as being able to jump and crouch, which I know sounds really basic, but this is all new stuff at the time and hadn't really been done before that much in shooters. Also, I think it's one of the first shooter games to have alt fire for weapons too, after of course Marathon and Pathways into Darkness. Dark Forces did also add the ability to look up and down, which was new for the genre, but it wasn't done in the best way, as you had to use the page up and down button to do it, which is awkward at best. And another thing that used to be a bit of a nightmare was trying to get this game to run on modern PCs. As it was made to run on DOS and not any modern operating system, you could get around this by using DOSBox, though you were stuck with any resolution it gave you and the input bindings were set in ancient DOS stone. But recently a mod called the Force Engine was released that made it much easier to play on modern systems. It has options for modern resolutions, controller support, remapping key bindings, a save system, and even mouse look. Also a bunch of other improvements that keep the feel of the game while still making it more playable on newer PCs. And it's all adjustable so you can set it up as close to the original as you want, so there shouldn't be an issue if you want an authentic experience going through the levels. Speaking of which, it has some interesting ones, as it does something that even the modern Star Wars stories can't seem to do, as it manages to have a wide variety of planets to visit without one of them being Tatooine. Even the one sort of desert-like moon in the game feels more like Mars than that overused hive of scum and villainy. Anyway, the levels in the game nail the Star Wars aesthetic even if they are a bit simple looking. Like, early shooters had to be abstract with level design and visuals because of technical limitations, so it's more about getting the vibes right than, say, realism, which can be tricky to do, but LucasArts managed to pull it off. And they even have some cool use of lighting, which I wasn't expecting. Like the staircase that has a pulsing lighting effect that gives the feeling of being near a dangerous power core. Or sometimes the game uses lighting to highlight where to go, which is a bit appreciated since this was when level design for first-person shooters was very maze-like. And this game isn't an exception to that, but the levels do feel a tiny bit more logical than, say, in Doom. This might be because LucasArts got some architects to help with the level design in this game. You'll really notice it in the levels which have Imperial bases, a lot of which feel imposing and oppressive as you'd expect an Imperial facility to feel like. This isn't the only type of level you'll encounter, as you'll go to the industrial gritty back alleys of Nar Shaddaa, which give the vibe that someone is going to attack you from the shadows around every corner. But the levels still having some maze-like design does make me not enjoy them as much as I would like to at times, though it's not terrible enough to keep me from staying immersed in the game, mostly. Another thing about the visuals, the 2D sprite enemies do a really good job of replicating the look of their movie counterparts, and the few unique ones in the game, like the Dark Troopers, feel like they fit right into the Star Wars universe. Another interesting design was Kyle's ship that drops him off on most missions, which to me has always been one of the cool looking ships from the Star Wars games. It's a very distinctive striking design that looks tough and fast, perfect for a merc. And I always wondered what it was called, like was it something iconic like Millennium Falcon or Ebon Hawk or Outrider? No, the name of the ship is the Moldy Crow. No words I could ever say would accurately describe how terrible a name that is for a Star Wars ship, and one that looks as good as this one does. I'm just gonna call it the Crow from now on and pretend I never heard that name. Let's go into something more positive. The game's music and audio effects do a great job of getting those Star Wars vibes going. A lot of the music is MIDI versions of the tracks you hear from the movies. They aren't half bad, and there are a few original tracks that were made for the game. Also, the game features dynamic music that will change depending on if you're walking around or just get into a fight, and even if you're just sneaking around while crouching. It is a little sudden at times, but mostly works pretty well. It's impressive the games were using this back then. The sound effects are also on point, with blasters and Imperials sounding very true to the movies.
You there, stop where you are.
Including the little droid sound effects too. Though there was one odd sound effect that confused me a little. These enemy bounty hunters, which are modeled after Bosk from Empire Strikes Back, makes this very unexpected sound when you shoot them. Like, it sounds as if you're shooting an American bald eagle, which wasn't what I imagined a big lizard alien would sound like. That was a weird choice for a sound effect, but other than that, the rest of the game sounds spot on. There were a few other things in the game that I wasn't expecting in a shooter that was released in the same era as Doom. Like the decent mission briefings before starting a level, I was expecting the game to just drop me into the level with a bit of flavor text like Doom did. But no, you get details on why you're going on the mission, with objectives and even pictures of what you might need to find in the level. Oh, and the environmental hazards are interesting too, like the icy ground that keeps you going in the wrong direction. It makes cliff edges a little more dangerous. I think this is the only game I've played where you need to get cleats for an ice level. Other interesting items include a headlamp, which is made redundant by the infrared goggles, but I think they wanted to show off the use of lighting in the game. Oh, and the gas mask that makes your breathing sound like Darth Vader. I wore the mask longer than I needed to. Maybe I sort of get why Kylo Ren likes wearing his mask so much. Anyway, while all those gadgets are useful, the main way you're going to be making progress in the game is blasting stormtroopers and figuring out some puzzles while doing a little platforming. The levels do use the classic key color card system from older games, but it's not the only way the game gates your progress, as there are some puzzles involving elevators and using codes you find in levels to make your way through them. Though the levels do start to get more progressively maze-like the further you get into the game, where you're going to have to start trying to figure out where to go by using that old shooter feature of an auto map. It does get a bit tedious, though I found I did eventually figure out where to go. It's not like marathon levels of getting lost. But I can see why gaming moved away from this type of level design. It's fine to use in small amounts or if that's the experience the game is going for, but too much and it sucks all the pacing away from a game. However, this kind of level design can be made up for a little by giving a steady pace of enemies to shoot at, with weapons that feel good to use. Though the game's auto-aim feature does mimic how a stormtrooper shoots a little too well at times, which can make it awkward to shoot precisely at what you want to in a large group of enemies, and there is the odd occasion where it really goes off track, but most of the time it works okay, which kept most of the weapons feeling fun to use. The Stormtrooper Blaster is especially enjoyable, which even though it is inaccurate at distance does feel really good to hold down the fire button on a large room of enemies. For me, it's almost as satisfying as using the shotgun in Doom, but in its own ways it's not as immediate as the shotgun, but it feels great to hold down the trigger and just wail on enemies. It can also deal a fair bit of damage pretty quickly if you're accurate with it, though at the cost of going through your ammo very rapidly, which if you do get low on you can switch to Kyle's Briar Pistol, which fires slowly but is far more accurate. Another interesting thing about the Briar Pistol is it's used by Cassian Andor in the newer Star Wars stories, which is a nice link between two characters who have stolen the Death Star plans, let's just say in different timelines. Though that's not the only similarities between the two, which I'll get into later in the story section. The rest of the weapons fill the slots you'd expect in a 90s shooter with a grenade launcher option and even a multi-barrel type machine gun. Though the most unique weapon is probably the Stoker concussion rifle that does a large amount of damage and can hit a lot of enemies at once. It's very fun to use on a large group, but don't use it at close ranges or you'll get caught in the blast. The game is pretty good at giving you weapons at a nice pace, and most weapons will have at least one use case for them. The shooting combined with the fast movement works well in making the game feel good to play with the mix of enemies you go against. Most have their own gimmicks you'll have to account for when fighting them, though some can be annoying in large groups. Like the Grand, the three-eyed goat-looking aliens that throw a never-ending amount of thermal detonators at you. I think these guys would later go on to inspire grenade spam in COD. I kinda hate them. It's them and the landmines that I really dislike. You can avoid them if you pay attention, but they are about as punishing as the ones in Fallout New Vegas. The game is also sneaky, like if you see a nice bunch of pickups there might be a landmine among them. The ones by doors are a little cheap though. But other than that, the levels generally offer a bit of a challenge while being fun to go through. And if you want to up the difficulty, the harder setting only really changes the number of enemies you'll face. No damage scaling or stuff like that. You'll just need to manage your ammo a bit, as it's pretty easy to go a little overboard with a Stormtrooper blaster and have no ammo left. But not all your weapons use the same ammo, so you won't often find yourself without options. Like the assault cannon that can do a lot of damage, and its alt fire as a rocket. I like how oversized it is, as it's the main weapon of the Dark Troopers and it gives you a nice reference for how big these troopers are. Speaking of which, you'll face 3 versions of them, with the first looking very similar to a Terminator. But unlike the movie reference, it's not too hard to deal with, it only uses melee attacks, so if you keep your distance, no problem. The Phase 2 is the scary one, as it can fly while using the assault cannon, and it's tanky and moves fast too. And the Phase 3 version, well, we'll chat about that one in the story section. Speaking of which, the story did help inspire a lot of things that show up later in the new canon that Disney has fumbled a bit while trying to set up. And it's not just the Dark Troopers, but some characters you can't help but see got a little inspiration from Kyle Katarn, like Andor, who is also a good shot and is not too keen on helping the rebels at first. Kyle was also not so hot on the idea of wanting to help the rebellion at the start. Though his reasons are different, he was an Imperial once, a pretty good one, as he had some good motivation to stop the rebellion as he was led to believe his parents were killed by rebels. But a rebellion double agent named Jan Ors, who worked with Kyle while she was undercover, finds some information that proves it was actually the Empire that killed his parents, and passes this info on to Kyle. This has the desired effect of him leaving the Imperial military. Though this story isn't shown in game, but via the game's manual, which is kinda cleverly framed as a report from Jan Ors to Mon Mothma, which talks about how Kyle isn't fully on the rebel side, more of a free agent, but that his history and training with the Empire does make him an asset to the cause. It's a nice bit of spycraft stuff that also shows up in some of the newer Star Wars stories. Now this is all great, but the actual in-game story does come off as more of a Saturday morning cartoon than one with deep intrigue a lot of the time. Which is fine, as not every story needs to be layered with themes that are thought-provoking. Sometimes they can just be fun, though the game does go a little overboard. I mean, the start of the game is already a bit over the top, as Kyle takes on an entire Imperial base and easily steals the Death Star plans by himself. It's fun, but if you think about it for a bit, this setup for stealing the Death Star plans was a little too easy considering how important they are.
This is too easy. Now to get to my ship.
Also, the story makes the Death Star seem like almost a minor problem the Rebellion had to deal with.
Kyle delivers the plans to the Rebel Alliance. Soon afterwards, the Death Star is destroyed. But even as the Alliance celebrates this victory, another sinister plot is set in motion that will become an even greater concern for the Rebellion.
And it really hypes up the Dark Troopers as an even bigger threat, which I mean, yeah, it's a powerful weapon for the Empire, though I don't think it's on the same level as a weapon that can wipe out entire planets. Anyway, enough nitpicking, let's get back into the story. We get to see a cutscene of Darth Vader and the head of the Dark Trooper project called General Mock, chat about the new Dark Troopers and see their first test run on a rebel base, which they wipe out.
Very impressive, General. The Emperor will be most pleased. Continue with your project.
Though back to Mon Mothma, she contacts Kyle so she can hire him to take out these new Dark Troopers, which the rebels already have some intel on thanks to an Imperial defector. As part of the deal, Kyle insists on getting some help from Jan Ors for the mission briefs and flying the crow, which Mon Mothma agrees to. So first order of business is to go to the rebel base that was attacked and see if there are any clues on how the Empire are making these new troopers. The level does a good job of showing how the rebels just got massacred at this base, as you see large areas that are just destroyed, and lots of rebels doing impressions of Luke's aunt and uncle. There are some Imperials who I assume are doing mop-up operations in what's left of the base. They aren't much of a challenge to deal with. Getting power back to the base, you eventually find a prototype weapon that was used by the Dark Troopers in their attack.
Jan? Go ahead, Kyle.
Looks like I found something that can help us out.
Get back to the landing pad and I'll meet you there.
On the weapon is a signature of an Imperial weapons specialist who kinda looks like a super creepy Dark Ark. He might have some intel on the Dark Troopers, so you should probably track him down. Now for some reason this Imperial has hidden himself in the sewers, which is a little odd, but I guess they wanted a sewer level in the game. He also programmed a bunch of droids to protect himself along with some hired muscle, which you'll encounter as you go through the mission and even fight a few of those junk monster things from A New Hope. I like that the sleazy Imperial used his skills to program a bunch of random droids to protect himself. Maybe the Empire wanted to get rid of him and he ran away while taking whatever droids he could with him. Well, that's my logic behind the odd collection of droids, because he has probe droids, torture droids and even training droids, which can be hard to shoot. It makes sense for this level, but for others later in the story, not so much. But I guess they did have to give a bit of variety for the enemies in Imperial levels, as only shooting stormtroopers by the dozen would have got boring. Anyway, you find the weapon specialist who doesn't help much, though you do get a bit of information on where some metal research relating to the Dark Troopers is being done. So Kyle and Jan head there, which is an Imperial base near some cliffs. You find metal samples that are being used to make the Dark Troopers, which can be traced back to an Imperial moon mining operation. It won't help with finding where they're making the Dark Troopers, but destroying it will slow down production. I mean, any excuse to attack and blow up an Imperial base is all Kyle needs. Near the end of this mission is where you'll have a fight with a Mark 1 Dark Trooper.
Put that cookie down! Now!
The explosive charges Kyle sets up to take out the base seem to be extremely powerful, like they set off an explosion nearly a quarter of the size of the moon. Who needs a Death Star? Just send Kyle with some extra explosives and the rebels will have a super weapon of their own. Now remember that Imperial defector who gave Mon Mothma the intel on the Dark Troopers? Well, he got caught and now he's gonna need some rescuing.
This contemptible excuse for an officer will no longer divulge any more information to that rebel, Kyle Katarn.
Katarn will not be as easy to deal with. He is very resourceful. More resourceful, it seems, than even your Dark Troopers.
I like how even Vader knows Kyle is probably going to succeed, but General Mock has an ace up his sleeve as he hires Boba Fett to take care of Kyle. We'll see how that turns out in a bit. So with some intel from Jan, Kyle breaks into the prison holding the Imperial defector. It's a bit of a coincidence that Andor's story also has a prison escape in it, though the circumstances are very different to be fair. No electric floors or rebellious chanting in this game. What you will have to watch out for are the walls in the prison, as they can deflect shots back at you, which you can use to shoot around corners a bit. Also, I did struggle with the elevator puzzle on this level, but did eventually realize there was a how to guide in the vent behind them, which helped to figure it out. Finally getting to the prisoner, you make your escape. The defector gives us a lot of intel on the Dark Troopers, so we can get on with blowing up more Imperial stuff. Though to find these places we first need to set up a tracking device on a smuggler ship, which is providing raw materials for the Empire's secret weapons project. This story point to me seems a bit odd, like it's the Empire, why would they need to use smugglers to get raw materials? I'm sure the Empire would have the resources for that without using smugglers. They did build the Death Star after all. Though maybe it's rare materials that are only available in the Outer Rim or something. Anyway, Kyle gets on with the shooting for a few missions, which eventually ends with fighting a Phase 2 Dark Trooper and blowing up a nice chunk of a planet again. With that sorted, we need to find a way they're putting together all the parts for the Dark Troopers. This leads us to Nar Shaddaa, where we need to find a Navi chip, while some eagle-sounding lizard bounty hunters try to take us down. But we get the chip after a few street and bar fights, though while leaving the planet we run into a problem. Turns out the smugglers have been working for Jabba the Hutt, and he's gotten tired of Kyle messing with his plans. So captures him along with Jan and decides to feed him to his favourite Kel dragon. Now they take away all of Kyle's weapons, but he's still got his fists, which he uses to bare knuckle brawl with a giant lizard and wins. Going through the ship you brawl with some other enemies and get to see what the Hutts consider fine art. Oh, and the landmines are the worst in this level. Kyle manages to rescue Jan and they both escape. With that behind them, they still need to use their Navi chip to find where the Dark Troopers are being made. Problem is, the only way to decode the chip is to use a computer located in the heart of an Imperial Intelligence Center, which is well defended and probably very hard to get to, though this shouldn't be a problem for Kyle. I mean, he literally punches dragons to death. The level does a good job of making you feel like you're breaking into the center of the Empire with all the Imperial regalia and the oppressive vibes you get from the architecture. It's also sort of another link between Kyle and Andor, as Andor also faces up against Imperial intelligence, though way more indirectly than Kyle does. It's also the level where Kyle faces up against Boba Fett at the end of the mission, though sadly, like most things involving Boba Fett, it's overhyped and anticlimactic, as the fight ends pretty quickly if you use the right weapon. Anyway, now that the Navi chip has been decoded, you find out that the ship the Arkhammer is where the Dark Troopers are being made. Though it doesn't get its supplies directly from the smugglers, but instead uses Darth Vader's Super Star Destroyer the Executor as a go-between to keep its location secret. Okay, so all Kyle needs to do is steal a smuggler's ship headed for the Executor, then after that wait for the right time to attack the Executor while it's transferring the cargo to the Arkhammer, then force his way onto the Arkhammer. Surprisingly, that all goes to plan, without a hitch. Kyle really is unstoppable. With all that done, the final mission is setting up the Arkhammer to blow and making an escape. Though this last mission is a bit tough as you'll face multiple Dark Troopers and a conveyor belt of death traps that will test your jumping and crouching skills. Oh, and a puzzle. Which if you survive all of that while setting all the explosive charges around the ship, you'll finally get to see the Phase 3 version of the Dark Trooper, which is a powered exosuit. In it is General Mock, and he wants a final battle with you. We all know how that's going to go for him. And all that's left is to escape while the Arkhammer blows up, with the game ending on a cutscene of Vader giving a hint to why Kyle is so unstoppable, and giving a bit of a teaser for the next game.
The Force is strong with Katarn.
So to me the game has a lot of charm as a Star Wars shooter from the 90s, with its levels being fun to go through without too much of that maze-like design that these type of games were known for, though there is still some. Its weapons feel good to use and shooting a near endless amount of stormtroopers for me at least stayed entertaining, and the story is enjoyable enough for me to not pick it apart too much. Only a little bit. Though with how Star Wars is now, it's kinda hard to imagine a single person doing the amount of damage Kyle can. But it's also interesting to see all the influences and similarities this game has to the more modern Star Wars stories, from Dark Troopers to newer Rebel heroes, which I think makes it worth doing a playthrough to experience if you're into Star Wars and retro shooters. Thanks for watching, see you next time.
Surrender immediately.